Dan, welcome to the QTS experience.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I want to start here. I don't know if this is the best place to start, but I want to start with the big picture. Power is one of the most important conversations. Certainly, it's one of the most common conversations in the data center world. Obviously, it's a regular topic here on the podcast. And all the events that I go to, public and private, utilities seem as surprised as the rest of us by the hockey stick of demand starting. Choose a point. 24 months ago, 48 months ago, doesn't matter to me. Post-COVID, we had this exponential growth, commonly referred to as the AI explosion, but it's everything. I don't know that it's just limited to artificial intelligence, but all the things that are coming together, and people are responding to that. What do you think the energy mix looks going forward? And what I mean by that is the market is saying, well, maybe it's on-site generation because public utility isn't fast enough. Public utility saying, hold on, we've been doing this for 120 years. It's in the same way you don't encourage people to just go out and stand up data centers. It's your core competency. This is our core competency. Let's do this together. Do you think there will be an emphasis on one or the other? Do you think it will be a hybrid? What does this world look like as you sit back and consider it?
So, there's a lot of folks running around saying the future is behind the meter gas, or the future is small modular reactors, or the future is this other thing. In reality, I think the situation is really far more complicated. The first priority of every data center end customer is still going to be utility power. With utility power, you get a mix of a good price and excellent reliability. And reliability is really, really important here. There are lots of places, though, where you just can't get utility power, or there is utility power, but the line for interconnection is long. What people are sort of missing is it's not just about electrons on the line, but it's about getting those electrons to you and interconnecting with you at a substation. The components that make up a substation, like the transformers, sometimes take a long time to get. Some utilities are not used to building many substations in parallel and don't really see why they should. These are really important, delicate parts of their transmission networks. So you're going to see something a little more complicated, which is for the next couple of years, you're going to see a lot of folks building natural gas plants, either next to or sort of behind the meter for data centers. Then what's going to happen in a lot of these cases is those natural gas plants and the data centers they serve are going to get utility interconnects built to them. And you're going to be in a situation where that natural gas plant is partially providing power to your data centers, partially providing power back to the utility. And when you need it, you can pull power from the utility. And that's great because it's grid stabilizing. Some of the moves we've seen recently, like taking nuclear power and putting it behind the meter, that is grid destabilizing. You're removing big sources of power on the grid. But when we build small natural gas plants, and small might be 800 megawatts, and we connect them to the grid, even if they're largely powering our data centers, they act in a grid stabilizing way because we rarely use 100% of the power from any power source for our data centers. If we're building an 800 megawatt data center and we have an 800 megawatt gas power plant, most of the time I'm using 60 or 70% of the power. And so the rest of those electrons can go stabilize the grid. So I think over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a lot of data center type projects with independent power producers building, which stuff for a while, which will be behind the grid, but eventually will go in front of the grid. And those data centers will just buy a power purchase agreement from those peaking power plants, which happens all the time now. So that's 3 to 5 years. I think what's going to happen past that is we're going to start seeing small modular reactors come online. And I think the first are going to come online in the 5 to 7 year time frame. I think the big issue keeping us from really deploying those is cost, and it's cost of the first unit. That first unit's going to be awfully expensive. I've seen some calculations from the Idaho National Lab that indicate that we will achieve economies of scale sometime between 14 and 19 units. So we're going to have to build a bunch of reactors, which should be obvious. One SMR might be only 300 megawatts, and you have to shut it down for a while for maintenance. So you really want to build 10 of those things in a plant to be able to power a new Albany or even part of an Ashburn or a Reno or any of the other DFW, any of the hot data center areas. So you're going to see these data center end customers, especially the large hyperscalers, sort of underwriting this nuclear renaissance because they needed to get power for their data centers for AI, which I think will be a transformative and positive thing for the entire country. Um, I think in the longer term, we're going to see even more interesting power. There's a couple of fusion power startups like Commonwealth Fusion. Google has purchased the entire output of Commonwealth Fusion's first plant in Virginia. Now, we don't have successful fusion power yet, but it's moved from being something super hypothetical to being a real possibility. We've gone from less than 1 second fusion reactions to recently there was a 400-second fusion reaction. We are very, very close to self sustaining fusion. And once we have self-sustaining fusion, we're going to be able to produce commercial power from fusion. In all likelihood, that's going to be about 10 years to get to 10-cent kilowatt power, 24 by 7 from fusion for folks like Commonwealth. So that's not tomorrow by any means, but sometime in the middle of the next decade. So I think we're going to see a combination of things like SMRs, natural gas, fusion. Now we are going to see renewables. The problem with renewables isn't the renewables. They're great. The problem is storing that power. And the question is, how do we, what happens when the sun doesn't shine? What happens when the wind doesn't blow? There's a couple of things we can do. There are BESS systems, which are these battery systems. The problem is batteries are dirty and they're expensive and they don't store much power and their charge discharge cycles are bad. So we are a couple of innovation cycles away from being able to store and utilize a lot of that wind and solar power. I hope we're still going to see it. I think there's a lot of push for innovation in those areas. It's a little bit more uncertain because we need that much better battery technology. And that better battery technology will help us in the nuclear and gas sides too. It'll help us in all kinds of ways, but we're not there quite yet. I'm not sure when we're going to get there. I think it's going to be a breakthrough situation where we're going to have a materials or chemistry breakthrough that's going to give us much better batteries. So I'm pretty bullish on the whole power situation. Mm-hmm. These needs, these deficits drive a great deal of innovation. And we're seeing a level of innovation now with power systems that we haven't seen for 50 years. I think that is absolutely positive for this country.
It seems like I agree with innovation, so many people, it's not like, I don't want to say it's not new chemistry. What I mean is I've had this in the lab for 10 years. I've had it for 18 years. We had an antibiotic over here at Eli Lilly or Procter and Gamble or whatever, but their marketplace didn't have an incentive. Like there wasn't an economic engine or there wasn't a circumstance. But the moment that changed, 2 or 3 people or 10 would say, well, I mean, we got a lot of work in this area. This might be interesting. And then it sort of, it accelerates. It seems like what you're describing is, on some of it is absolutely new, but a lot of them they're new to the public, but privately they've been kicked around. They've been in white papers. They've been discussed. They've been in labs, whether it's one of the national labs or whatever, for a while. There just was either regulation or not an economic engine or something that said, nah, we're not really looking at that. And now many of them are being evaluated and determined, can we apply these? Seems like there's a lot of appetite to do it now.
A good example is the SMR technology. It's not new. I've seen EBR2, which was, people are going to use as a model for a lot of the SMRs. That is not a new device. It's a reactor that was there for decades and has been shut down. We've had this technology. We just haven't been willing to actually deploy it at scale. It's a funny thing. As a civilization, we got very comfortable with our energy situation. And until some of these really, really big companies that have massive war chests had a great need, we were sort of resting on our laurels. We're not doing that now. And I think that's really good. There.
Yeah, I completely agree. You're reminding me of a question I wanted to ask you, which is this. So for the longest time, I don't even know how many, a couple decades at least, what we built in the multi-tenant, I don't mean what a hyperscale might build for itself or a university might build for itself. I'm just talking about You can call it colocation. I would call it multi-tenant data center. I build an infrastructure, square or rectangle, and it can serve a pretty broad range of constituencies affordably. Or you used to be able to, from 100 kW a square foot to 300 kW square foot, and the weight underneath it and the connectivity infrastructure needed, all the things, logistics, etc. Choose a time, COVID forward, that's been disrupted. But one of the cool things of this world was when people came to finance, the capital markets, whether it was a private equity or the public or whatever, they understood what was going on, and they would lean in towards, depending upon what your philosophy was, your market share was, they would lean in on financing that. Well, now the numbers are bigger than ever, but do you think the markets are more, hey, I really like these organizations that are serving these 3 or 4 customers, or 1 or 2 sectors, or 1 or 2 workloads, or these others that, like Warren Buffett would talk about diversification and these other things, these other groups over here that have a couple dozen or 5 dozen, some mix of hyperscale and enterprise, and maybe even some government stuff thrown in. But now the design gets more vanilla because I don't want to make a unique design. Do you think about that very often, that tension?
All the time. And so the only guidance I can give there is from the people who write the checks.
Okay.
So which are in most cases the private equity firms.
Okay.
When they ask me to do due diligence on a data center project, which happens all the time, the number one, there are 2 questions they ask. One is, what is the SLA situation? Because you never know, what's going on with that. But the big one is, what is the releasing risk on this data center? So in other words, you're building a 30, 35, 40-year asset, but the lease at a maximum is 15 years. So what happens at 15 years and a day? Now, we know that chances are that at 15 years and a day, the same tenant is going to be there, but what if they're not? And so if you're building something that's only going to work for one tenant ever, well, you may be in trouble 15 years in a day. You have to build something that has some degree of flexibility built into it. There was a period of time in this industry when there were like 4 customers. I think that a number of factors have changed that. AI, certainly. I think there are, companies, it's not just sort of the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons and, the Metas. I think we now have, lots of other folks in the space, certainly from the Oracles and the Alibabas and the ByteDances, but also a lot of the what you might call the GPU neo clouds. CoreWeave is buying a lot. You've got the Applied Digitals of the world, Nebius. You've got folks like OpenAI and Anthropic. There's a dozen others. And so that's, from the point of view of the investors, that's really good, because for customers is sort of, makes you a little nervous. But you do have to build a data center that could be used for at least 2 uses. So in other words, building a data center that can only ever be used as an AI training data center, where the super high power density in the middle of nowhere is a little bit riskier. Whereas if you build something that is in a location where you could use it for cloud, you could use it for AI training, you could use it for AI inference, you could use it for regular internet applications, you might even be able to use it for enterprise. That is a lot more valuable to the investor because they can be more confident in their releasing risk. Now, that's a little bit harder to do. It requires a little more skill, but you can certainly do it. One other thing to ponder there, though, is a lot of people are like, well, what about the existing data centers? Aren't they obsolete? Are we going to have to light them on fire? What's the deal with them? No, there's always going to be enterprise demand for data centers of lower power density. There's always going to be cloud demand. Cloud still grows 20% year over year. It's like AI happened and we forgot cloud. Cloud grows 20% year over year and doesn't need 150 kilowatts of cabinet. So my favorite data center is an Equinix data center that is 27 years old. The reason it's my favorite is it was an original Exodus data center. Exodus, which most folks don't. I know you remember that name, but most folks don't. And when I was at Google, I saw Google's first co-location lease. One of the very, very senior executives there before he retired sent me a copy of it. And it was for Exodus and it was for that site. It was like for 2 racks. And that facility is still operating 27 years later. And of course, it's like 100% margin. It's only like, 6 or 8 megawatts,
Mhm.
but it's full of stuff with people paying rent every single month. And so as long as as you're not locking yourself into one customer and one use, I'm pretty confident in the utility of the facilities we're building.
Let me ask you this then, though. So, if you're evaluating data centers or for capital markets, do you talk to whether it's an operator like me or our customers? Because like we're also trying to figure it out. We on the one hand we want standardization. Standardization gets me the three legs of the stool, which are speed, accuracy, and um, when I say cost, I just mean predictability and my expense. To the degree I change, and I know you know this, to the degree I change one of those things, I'm affecting speed, accuracy, or cost. And we want to avoid rework at all possible. All of those things. Safety's got to be enhanced. Like they're all put in jeopardy when you change from a standard. At the same time, like you read the same press releases I do. You sit in the same innovation council meetings that I do with our customers. What is their standard rack? And I don't just mean in AI training, I mean across cloud loads and other things. Where is this supplemented with GPUs? What does it look like? And we, as an operator, are supplying them. And so we have standard designs. And so we're trying to standardize on the smallest Lego possible that gives us flexibility to redeploy. How is this impacting data center design, not just the finance?
Yeah. For 20 years in this industry, we were able to use a very similar design that was, evolutionary, not revolutionary. I thought of it almost as a sausage machine. You put in the capital and you turn the crank for a while, and out come data centers, and you put them in the same places over and over again. And what them as an industry is we were capital efficient. And sometimes we'd miss on supply and demand, but things would eventually work out. And we didn't need to innovate a lot and we didn't need a lot of strategy. In the last 2 years, that has changed entirely. And for some folks, it's caught them a little bit flat footed, where, a lot of data center providers didn't have a real strategy function or didn't have a real innovation function. And that hurt them because, we're in a period of time where no one is sure what their standard data center build is. No one is sure what their standard rack is. No one is sure of what the Delta T across which in the front of the back of the rack is. No one is sure what the cooling technology is. Folks will say so, but they're saying so in the moment. Right. You don't really know what's going to happen in 6 months. No one knows what's going to happen in 6 months. Right. So that requires, so we went from a world where we had no knobs to turn to a world where we've got about 8 knobs to turn, which is really, really difficult. Before it was just a question of efficiency. Now we've got all kinds of questions we have to answer. And we have customers who will say, this is what I want you to build. But what they want you to build, you have to be really, really careful that is going to be a facility that will last. And so you get into more of a negotiation with them about what might be built and where the interface is between the provider and the customer. If you're smart about where that interface is, it's almost like an API in coding where you say, okay, this is a layer of abstraction. And on your side of the abstraction layer, you do what you want. And on our side of the abstraction layer, we will produce a standardized design. But that means you have to be able to support a wide range. The thing you hear sometimes is 0 to 100% air and 0 to 100% direct to chip liquid cooling, which means I can use any technology I want in that server to remove heat, which is, frankly, phenomenally difficult to do. And so figuring out where that interface is, where that API is, where the demarcation is between the customer and the provider, and what you build on that provider side has become really, really difficult. And the thing that exacerbates this is that one of the things we haven't done well as an industry, there hasn't been that much movement between the end customers and the providers of data centers, like in terms of people.
Mm.
Like in many industries, you will see people sort of circulate around. You see this in the utility side too. It's rare to find utility people working in the data center field and vice versa. It's rare to find hyperscaler people working on for data center providers or vice versa. And that's something we've got to fix because we have to talk the same language to be efficient and reasonable partners for the next decade.
Hmm. Well, usually opportunity will drive that. Do you think, like, how do we accelerate that? One of the things that we've learned or we've seen, this is no secret now, but we went and attracted a lot of project management that come out of oil and gas and some other industries that have their ebbs and flows. Rocketry and other places, they're having a moment now, but they were having a moment where they're technology minded. They deal with big things, safety and risk there's a lot of commonality there. They're used to following SOPs and MOPs, et cetera. And they're world-class project managers. And so we go looking for these things and we find these people that fit our culture and we bring them in. And the cross-pollination then is we start learning, not that we're going to have launch pads or earth stations at our data centers anytime soon, but I'm all in for if we want to do that. But we learn this lingo, and as we interact with these different groups, the language is similar enough that we can bridge the gap. So how do we do that in the areas that you're talking about? How do we facilitate that movement?
It's tough because a lot of the folks who are coming out of the end customer side are going to the financial side. That's the folks, the MGXs and the Blackstones and Thor Equities and all the folks who write really big checks for data centers, they say, oh, well, if we're going to write a 20 or $30 billion check, I need to understand this industry from the point of view of the people signing the leases.
Right.
Again, I think there needs to be intentionality here. I think this is one of those things that you've just got to actually go and sort of make happen. And I think that's tricky. I think it's hard. I wish I had a better answer for how to make it happen. But we're doing it on the utility side, right? It's hard, but we are getting slowly, painfully, we are getting power people into the data center industry. And every person we bring in makes us much, much better. It makes us much better at dealing with our utility power, our utility partners. So it is absolutely doable. It's one of those things that at first looks intractable, and it just gets easier each time.
Does it make the utility more vulnerable because we're taking experienced people and moving them out of that world into the data center world? So on the one hand, we've increased our emotional intelligence, but is there a backfill of utility people to fill the void? I know it's a trickle now, but how do we make sure that we're just changing the scale's gone from this way to this way?
I think in the utilities, I think sometimes career growth can be slow. So I think it's actually pretty positive for the utilities. There's folks who will stay and work at a particular utility for 20 or 30 years. So I think it's helpful. And I think that the sheer opportunity to remove some of the friction and misunderstanding between, a provider and a partner or a provider and a customer is so valuable that it's worth it to all parties involved.
Thank you again. I'm keeping an eye on the time. God, I always do this. I have so many questions. You've inspired so many more, but there's an area that's really interesting to me. I would love your commentary on this. While we're talking about data center design, access to infrastructure, and these other things, the other thing that's come along with that time-honored tradition with data centers is site selection. Where are we going to go? And rarely, I can't speak for all data center providers, but in our case, we don't go speculate. We're not building a very expensive asset in the hopes that you build it, they'll come. It's not a field of dreams. We have opportunities. We get the right combination of things. Today, once I remember early days when we would evaluate a site, if it was near a natural gas pipeline, if it had water nearby, if it had some geographic risk or an airport or something like that, it would greatly influence whether you were even interested, whether your customers were interested, et cetera. Is that still true? I mean, the overwhelming were the three, at least in my experience, were access to connectivity within a certain latency range, access to power of a certain starting and price, but growth model, and then the both the finances, both the cost of the land and the business environment. So those are sort of the three big things. There were other things of logistics and talent and whatever, but that was sort of some combination of those three. Is it still the same pressure now, or is it, look, we'll figure out the connectivity story. Power dominates everything. We'll figure out these other things. Or is it really still that same trifecta, or are there things we're not even thinking about?
So what's interesting is a lot of those rules in the old days, like around airports and stuff like that, we just made those up, right? There was no actual data, there's no actuarial history. It was like, okay, what do we think could happen? What do we want to avoid? But as data centers developed, like we just ignored all that.
Yeah.
And a good example is, the largest concentration of data centers in the world is in Ashburn, Virginia. And a lot of them are at the end of the runway off Dulles Airport. And so, we kept to those rules until the minute they became inconvenient and right out the window. And that's because a lot of them weren't really based in data. And so we kept the ones that were based in data. We ejected the rest. And like many other things in many industries, people had wanted a set of criteria. So we made up a set of criteria to keep people happy because you have to have some criteria. We're in a different place in the data center industry now where, the criteria are very different. Some of the stuff from the old days is still there. We care a lot about flood zones, right?
Yeah.
Super important. We care about the environmental situation. Is it a zone in which we can put diesel generators or not? Can we operate them? There are other risk things. Are there hurricanes that come in? Is it Galveston, Texas? That sort of thing. But at the end of the day, there are really two things that are still important for data center siting. One is, to your point, power, and the second is network. Network is still incredibly important. The number one reason why data center sites fail due diligence is network, because somebody has a site with power and the power checks out, but the nearest fiber is 100 miles away. And and you need it in four directions, and you need it a bunch. Someone's got to write a $200 million check for the fiber, which is probably the end customer. And so the deal doesn't work out anymore. It's not that it's impossible to do, it's that the deal economics are suddenly different than you thought they were. And so that becomes a big deal. It's absolutely possible to build a data center somewhere you have plenty of power and the fiber is 5 miles away or 10 miles away. Those are doable builds that are reasonably economical, so long as it can be built. I've seen sites where there aren't public rights of way, where there's ranch land, there's Native American reservations, where there's hard topologies like mountains, large bodies of water. Those aren't going to work. Those are not going to work. There's no amount of money, well, there are, but again, the amounts of money are such that they will ruin the deal economics. So you have to be really, really careful about this. But there's a reason why on the network side that data center developers hire really, really good network folks. And I wrote a research note on this called the Type A Network Killers about, these network people who are not, hey, I can put a LAN switch in the closet, but are the folks who really are experts in inside plant, outside plant, provisioning, IP peering, the whole 9 yards. You're going to be QTS as Joe Graves and John Ofterheide, who's someone I worked with at Google for a long time. They're real experts in this area. The data center developers and operators who have folks like that tend to succeed. The ones that don't, it's a pretty rough situation because they end up doing site selection over and over again because they buy or option a site and then they go to a potential buyer and for some reason it fails due diligence. I had a couple of years ago, when I was still at Google, I had a really, really smart developer, one of the smartest I knew. And he came to me, we had coffee at Starbucks, and he threw, a couple of plats of land in front of me and said, why do we keep failing due diligence? I'm like, well, where's the fiber? And he said, well, there's AT&T crossing the corner of the property here. I said, that's why you fail due diligence, because there's no fiber. That's like a long haul route that has like voice traffic on it. There's no fiber. And he said, that's really important. I said, it's all important because a data center that doesn't have network is a super, super expensive cold white box.
Yeah, my wife would call it a she shed. That's exactly
There you
what it
go.
is.
And so that combination of power and network, those are still the things. Now, the one thing that isn't as important anymore, that used to be super important, is water. There's still a few end customers who insist on a lot of water. They're very conservative. They don't want to change their ways. But there are some very good data center providers who are building at scale data centers with no or very little water, and it works just fine with a good PUE and a good CapEx price. Your company is one of them. There are a couple others too, and it works just fine.
Yeah, I agree. I think the marketplace is going to work them out unless there's some very unusual bespoke situation where that's got it like that. We're going to run that to its end of life and it's not a strict fair. There might be a few of those. That's fine, but it's not the norm, and it won't be the norm in places we want to go across Europe, and certainly as we move into the western part of the United States, and like it's just not. And but I think if they don't change, the world will change it for them. It's just like when we started PUE, like the big provider said, you will. As it's inexact, but it's a start, and we've been refining it. You will do this, or you will not do business with us. It's just that simple. And these are the kinds of conversations I think we're having.
Absolutely.
One last question before we go, if you don't mind, and it's this. Maybe we don't have time for it, but I'm really interested. So we're talking about all of this energy. We're talking about these conversations we have to get sophisticated about. But at the end of the day, it comes back to how data centers, the data center business, or as my friends in Texas say, business, is I'm providing customer environments, what we would call white space or the data hall or IT load. And so I have some number of racks with infrastructure deployed in a data center, and they have to be cooled. And in all of these things, it's uncommon that there is not a densification conversation. Even in the case of cloud, maybe it's just incrementally more, but it is, and it's not necessarily GPUs, but it is, I want to get more out of this rack of compute, which means I'm going to generate some amount of heat, in some cases a tremendous more amount of heat. I have a density of network infrastructure within that. And in order to resolve all of that so it can operate safely, we've got to cool it, however we're cooling it.
Right.
And so how is this impacting like how we think of personal protection gear? Like we think about it with electricity, but I don't know if we think about it with cooling. How's this impacting? Is it cold plate back to chip, or, to the chip? Is it submersion? How are we thinking of these things?
So what's interesting is sort of the why, which you touched on.
Okay.
Which is the reason why the power densities are going up so much is because of a property of these GPUs. These GPUs, say I'm a GPU and you're a GPU. Mm-hmm. One of the ways GPUs operate is something called remote direct memory access. I use your memory and you use my memory, which means that the network connecting them has to be super, super low latency, which means the fiber has to be really, really short. And so the first time I built one of these was about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was probably one of the first in the industry. And I recall asking one of the developers of the chips, I said, how short do these fiber runs need to be? And he said, as short as possible. I said, you really care about a few feet? He said, yes. I said, how can you even measure that? And he said, I don't know, but you've got to trust me that a few feet matter. I thought he was full of it. He was right. Because a few feet is the difference between one of these clusters crashing because there isn't enough time for me to fetch the memory on your GPU. And so what has happened because of this is we've had to crowd more and more GPUs into the same physical space to keep those fiber runs ultra short. And in theory, you have 50 meters. In reality, you've got a lot less if you don't want your cluster to crash, a third of the time, which is very expensive. So what's happened is we went to 50 kilowatts or so we started at 5 or 10 or 15 kilowatts a rack, reasonable numbers. We're now at 100 or 120 kilowatts a rack, NVIDIA says we're headed for 600 kilowatts a rack. The good news is that rack won't look like the rack today. It'll look like a shorter, broader rack. But in that same 22 square foot footprint, we're still talking about 200 kilowatts in that rack.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an increase of about 20x in just a few years.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly difficult to do. And so the way most folks are doing this is they're doing either water or they're doing PG25 Dow freeze, which is polyethylene glycol 25% in water. It has pretty good heat transfer characteristics. You don't get algae blooms in there. We have to worry about biofilms on the heat transfer surfaces because any small change in that heat transfer surface, and we start losing money because we can no longer operate those GPUs at 100%. We have to worry about little particulates in there. We have to sample the water. We have to worry about the water chemistry. So along the way, yeah, there are concerns about people. I have seen, a lot of these GPU machines are connected to the CDUs, the pumping units via flexible hoses. And in a lot of cases, these flexible hoses have quick disconnects, so I can quickly get a server in and out. The problem is if you've ever worked with these quick disconnects is, once every 100 operations, they won't actually seal properly and they will squirt at you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you get a face full of,
Whatever.
40 degrees C Dow freeze, which is not something you really want to do. So people are having to do things like wear, goggles, and they have face shields, and you might have an apron on, and you have to worry about leak detection. The other interest, and that's not bad, right?
Right.
It's not going to kill you unless you drink a bunch of it.
Mm-hmm.
The thing you have to watch out for is the next generation of cooling. And the next generation of cooling won't be Dow freeze. It's going to use a refrigerant, and the refrigerant is going to be two-phase. What I mean by that is, as you put it through the cold plate, it's going to boil. And it may be a refrigerant that boils at room temperature or a refrigerant that boils at maybe 140 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's going to boil. And it's going to turn into a gas, and then it's going to be condensed again, when it goes back and gets cooled off. And the problem with a lot of those refrigerant gases, they're generally not toxic, although a couple of them are. But what they will do is they're heavier than air. And so if you get a leak from one or more of these racks, you may have a gas, a refrigerant gas that's heavier than air, and it displaces the oxygen in your lungs. So when you're breathing it in, it's odorless. You don't really know what's going on. You don't know that there's a leak unless you're well instrumented, but you're going to start feeling lightheaded, and eventually you're going to pass out. And if you pass out, now you're on the floor where there's no oxygen at all, and it's very bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we're going to have to be really careful about, our ability to do things like rapidly ventilate data center floors. We may have to have an emergency ventilation system like we do in some battery wells to, in case there's a big hydrogen buildup. There may have to be a big fan somewhere where someone hits a red button and,
Right.
in comes the fresh air from the outside. We're going to have detection systems for this. Now, this isn't anything new. In really big industrial HVAC systems, people have known there's issues like this, but, it's generally not an issue in a several 100,000 square foot building. But, we are going to have to embrace technologies like that, and we're just going to have to be a little bit careful about how we do it. The good news is our critical facility technicians, as a group across the industry, are phenomenally well trained. They're all a lot of them are veterans. They've got, on average, at least 10, 15 years of experience. There really are few folks I would trust better with that kind of technology.
Yeah. It just, it's a conversation that at least in my case, I've not thought of. We've talked past, we'll talk about the various candidates on what the cooling infrastructure is going to look like, but not the impact to the human beings that will be in and out. We do around electricity when we talk about more and more voltage and coming in, but it's just an area. We've got some folks coming in from Open Compute that are going to talk about this as well, but it is an eye opener to think about, especially when back in that 20-year time frame, we kept trying to engineer complexity out, and now complexity in all of this stuff, designing them, building them, operating them, and maintaining them. I love being in the business. It seems like it's there's so much opportunity and so many opportunities to solve challenges. And if you are able to help solve challenges and do hard things, you probably got a career ahead of you.
Well, this industry is about change.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the great things about working in it is that we have to figure out how to support the next generation of technology. Heck, we're still figuring out just with the current generation of technology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that keeps it new and fresh and really exciting. And it's one of the reasons I'm happy to be here.
Dan, we talked about a lot. I would keep you for another 2 hours, but I don't want to interrupt your planning for your cruise. And thank you. We're going to have down links to your organization and to your LinkedIn profile down below. Thanks for coming on today. I appreciate it.
Thanks. It was great to be here.
Hey, everybody. If you enjoyed that conversation, click the like button. And if you loved it, click the subscribe button. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.